Hello folks, coming up on this week's episode of This Week, back at home from the Bahrain Grand Prix, and it was an absolute thriller. We will look back over Formula One's first weekend of the 2021 season, where the expected favourites were indeed favourites, but they were not Grand Prix winners. We'll look at Formula 2, which of course also took place over the weekend. We'll look at MotoGP, which had their first race weekend of the season, along with Moto2 and Moto3, and a whole lot else as well, all coming up this week on this week's episode of This Week. Welcome back then folks to my channel, welcome back to This Week. Thank you for your continued support, for your subscriptions, for ringing that notification bell, for your comments and your questions. As I say every week, I do read them all, I genuinely do. And yeah, thank you so much for coming back. Thank you for buying the merch. Really appreciate that, as do my charity partners, Every Kid Sports in the US and Street Games in the UK. As I said, we are back from Bahrain. It was a great first week for Formula One. Being back there in Bahrain, of course, we'd only been there a couple of weeks previously for pre-season testing, but the Grand Prix itself was fantastic and showed us that what we imagined to be true after testing is in fact true. Red Bull Racing are the favourites for this season. They do have the fastest car. Mercedes' woes, while not quite as pronounced as we believed them to be after testing, they do exist. And Mercedes has admitted that even though it won the Grand Prix, it is on the back foot and it doesn't see itself as being ahead of Red Bull in any perceptible area. Although perhaps, having seen the result of the race, one might say that strategy is an area where Mercedes does still have the edge. They managed to turn around a slower car, an inferior car, into a race-winning car. Lewis Hamilton, of course, had to put that performance in, and it was a fantastic win for them, because Max Verstappen and Red Bull, by rights, should have won the Bahrain Grand Prix. Yes, there was controversy. I've made a video about it earlier today, which you can watch on my channel, about the question of track limits and why Max Verstappen's move around the outside of Lewis Hamilton at turn 4 was not legal, and yet Lewis, and in fact pretty much every other driver in the field, going wide at turn 4 was legal. Essentially two very similar but very different rules over that part of the track were in operation. So go and give that a little watch, and it'll explain all of the ins and outs, plus a little bit of a rant on track limits from me. I've always been a bit of a stickler for them. Anyway, Christian Horner and Toto Wolff have both demanded clarity from the FIA moving forward when we look at track limits. Sergio Perez had a battling drive for Red Bull, despite the fact that his RB16B conked out on the formation lap, but Checo just used his old noggin, Control-Alt-Delete, restarted it, switched it off and on again, and managed to put in a brilliant race. One wonders what he might have been able to achieve had he started from where he was supposed to, rather than from the pit lane for the Grand Prix, but a great first race for him. McLaren confirmed in third place in the Constructors' Championship after this first weekend, but are they top of the midfield? It's a fascinating question. Lando had a great race. Daniel Ricciardo had a really good race, and McLaren confirmed yesterday after the Grand Prix that he actually suffered floor damage on the opening lap of the race, which he had to contend with for the whole Grand Prix after Pierre Gasly had driven into the back of him. And when we talk about Pierre Gasly, we have to talk about AlphaTauri and the unfulfilled potential of that team in Bahrain. Gasly taking on the damage on the first lap of the race, having run into the back of Ricciardo. There was definitely more to come. That car was a rocket ship all weekend, and we saw that at the hand of Yuki Tsunoda, who made a massive impression in his first weekend in the sport, scoring points, having started from well outside the points. Super impressive. Immediately making headlines, and everybody, I think, in Formula One falling a little bit in love with Yuki Tsunoda straight off the bat. Ferrari looked good as well, you know. Double point score for them. Carlos Sainz immediately comfortable at the team, and punching way above where anybody thought that they might be. When we look at the rest of the midfield, Alpine probably towards the bottom of that mix at the moment, where I personally had expected them to be, not where they had expected to be. And Aston Martin, yeah, okay, they got a point with Lance Stroll, but they're struggling. The car is much slower than they had believed it would be. They've lost well over 2 seconds from last year. Actually, Mercedes have lost about the same amount of time, but Aston are about a second off the pace of where they thought they would be, and it's going to be a hard slog for them to recoup and recapture the position that they had expected to find themselves in. And Sebastian Vettel, for all of the talk of coming back rejuvenated and refreshed, and would we get the old Seb, or would we get the same Seb? The jury's out. But he didn't have a great weekend. He had a really, really hard time. Penalty in qualifying, starting from the back of the grid, made contact with Esteban Ocon, got penalty points. It was a messy first weekend for Sebastian Vettel. Alfa Romeo, meanwhile, looked to have taken a massive step forward and were really unlucky not to score points. And who else is left? Oh, Haas, horrible weekend for them, really. Car didn't look great. Mazepin didn't even last 2.5 corners. Mick Schumacher spun it into the gravel as well. Car looks really difficult to drive, but Mick managed to keep it going and did at least bring it home. And Williams have taken a good step forward. So, yeah. That was Bahrain. It was a great weekend. The race itself, we talk about the battle at the front, but it was the battle all the way through the field that made it such an exciting and an exhilarating contest. There were proper scraps. The length and breadth of the field, it was a really great start to the 2021 season. In other Formula One news, there is still no announcement over plans to run sprint races at certain events in 2021. The sports organisers and the teams were having discussions about that throughout the weekend, so we expect some news on that to come, but we don't know as yet when that will be, as they just seek to get the nuances and, cross the T's and dot the I's over the still very controversial subject of sprint races. And talking about sprint races, wow, look at this, no edit yet. Talking about sprint races, Formula 2 had its first race weekend of the 2021 season, where it ran for the first time 3 races, 2 sprint races followed by a feature, and the 2 sprint races were won by 2 rookies, Liam Lawson and Oscar Piastri. Piastri, of course, the Formula 3 champion. Great races, super exciting as well. Really enjoyed that. Guan Yu Zhou won the feature race and will go into round 2 of their season as the championship leader, from Liam Lawson in second place and Jehan Daruvala, who had a really good weekend just across the board, to take third place in the Drivers' Championship for Formula 2. Formula 2 and Formula 3 going week on, week off throughout this season, so it'll be a while for Formula 2 until their next race. Now, while we're talking about things a little bit different, and with folks getting worried about racing being a bit gimmicky, I want to roll stateside, where NASCAR held its first dirt race in over half a century, as the Bristol Motor Speedway was specially prepared with a thick dirt surface for a weekend of action which looked like something out of a computer game or a movie. It was incredible. What a show. The race was ultimately delayed because heavy rainfall over the weekend ultimately turned that dirt surface into mud. But the delayed race on Monday saw Joey Logano beat Denny Hamlin after a late caution created a 2-lap sort of sprint at the end, overtime, 2-lap overtime. The event was a huge success, absolutely massive success, not just for NASCAR and its fans, but just for fans of racing all around the world, watching those NASCARs getting sideways on the dirt. Everyone was talking about it. David Coulthard walked past me in the F1 paddock and was like, "Oh my goodness, did you see that NASCAR?" It was amazing. We were just loving it, loving the content coming out of NASCAR this weekend. Great stuff. And the event will be back in 2022, so can't wait for that. Hamlin now leads the championship from Logano, with Martin Truex Jr. in third. Now let's stay stateside and let's look at Indycar, who had a big test at Indianapolis as they prepare for a move to hybrid units in 2023 and the introduction of KERS. Those of you new to this may need to know that KERS stands for Kinetic Energy Recovery System. It's the thing they used to use in Formula One before the full hybridization of the power units that we now have. The drivers had to simulate the effects of KERS with the current engines, and so they did that by using their push-to-pass boost system reduced to 1.5 bar. The results were, should we say, mixed? It certainly provided a lot of lessons for the future, though, as they aim for a 900 horsepower unit straight out of the box in 2023. IndyCar, meanwhile, has had its last road course test for a couple of teams, including Dale Coyne with Romain Grosjean getting back behind the wheel. His last opportunity to do so before the season starts at Barber Motorsport Park on April the 16th. And finally, stateside, a sad story, and actually a really confusing one that I still haven't been able to get my head around in American Formula 4, where Juju Noda, who you may remember we spoke about earlier in the year, the teenage female Japanese racing sensation, she topped the practice session. The opening practice session, topped it. Mega job. Her time would have been good enough for pole position, but she never even started qualifying. Never took part in the rest of the weekend. There was this bizarre statement that was released which sort of asked as many questions as it answered, and left no clear indication over whether she would be back for another weekend, whether her Formula 4 season is over. It's all very strange and ultimately really disappointing because, as you know, I rate Juju really highly, and seeing her season disrupted this early, I think it's a real shame and a real worry. With 2 wins and a second, though, Jason Alder leads the championship with 5 events and 15 races remaining in the US Formula 4 Championship. Now, over in Formula E, big news during the week as both Porsche and Nissan have confirmed their commitment to the championship for the 3rd generation of Formula E. They joined DS and Mahindra in having confirmed their future participation. In other Formula E news, Rome and Valencia will both now have double-header races as COVID-related question marks hang over some of the future rounds in the calendar. Gotta say, getting a few extra races in early is actually a pretty smart move if you need to offset the potential for cancellations later in the season. And talking of disruption, Nissan, the aforementioned Nissan, has had to delay the debut of its newest Formula E powertrain due to delays and problems and the supply chain being sort of thrown around a little bit due to COVID restrictions and the ongoing difficulties created by the global pandemic. No such worries, though, for Formula E's sister championship, Extreme E, which has its first round this coming weekend in Saudi Arabia. And finally, to MotoGP, which got its season underway at the weekend in Qatar. And while Formula One was debating its track limits issues, MotoGP had pressure sensors around the track. One wheel off, bang, you're in the book. Yeah, I like that. Maybe something to be thought about for the future. Although Formula One did have that. When was it? 2014? No, 2016. I think 2016 in Hungary. They had pressure sensors outside some of the corners. Turn 4, actually, as I recall. Anyway, I digress. The opening round of the MotoGP season was won by Maverick Vinales in his his Yamaha. Keep saying drivers and in rather than riders and on. You can tell I'm more used to 4 wheels than 2. Ducati, though, got the best start in the race itself. All 4 of their riders straight to the front, dominating proceedings, but Vinales overcame the Ducati threat to win the race, the other 2 places being taken by Ducatis, and reigning champion Joan Mir almost getting onto that podium, just being denied at the last in 4th place. It was a miserable day though for Honda and for KTM. Espargaro, Honda's highest placed finisher, in 8th, and Oliveira 13th for KTM. Really tough weekend for KTM, a lot of work to do for them. In Moto 2, Sam Lowes dominated to beat Remy Gardner, and an emotional Gresini podium for Gian Antonio. After the death, of course, of Fausto Gresini just a few weeks ago. In Moto 3, Jaume Masia won, and it was a thrilling race in Moto 3. He won that race, of course, for KTM. And that, folks, is pretty much that for this episode of this week. A slightly shorter, truncated version today, as I also had to make the other video that I made today all about the track limits issue in Formula 1. I hope you forgive me for that. More coming your way, of course, in 7 days' time, where we will look back at all of the news and all of the racing that's taken place during the week. That's it for now. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate all of your support and all of your subscriptions, and I will look forward to seeing you next week for the next edition of This Week.